Hey you guys, this is Professor Vitt and welcome to Chapter 3 on sources. Yeah, okay. You can hopefully see me in the corner this time and I hope that's a little bit more eventful for you. I apologize. The last one I recorded the whole thing and I wasn't on there, so I'm sorry. And I know that's rough to just look at a PowerPoint the whole time. Not that it's much better to look at my mug, but at least it's something, right? Okay, this chapter is about sources. So remember, this is the very first thing that we look at in our critical thinking chart. We go sources, and then we go, logic, and then we have, we kind of progress through that course outline. We're going to start right now at sources, and the overriding principle for sources is this one. Garbage in, garbage out, right? If you are getting, if you are the best baker in the world and someone gives you rotten eggs, rotten flour, and rotten sugar, you're not going to make a very good cake, right? It doesn't matter how good of a baker you are. The same thing is true for critical thinking. If you're getting your information from bad sources, it doesn't matter how smart you are, you're going to be wrong, right? You can't run a car on peanut butter. You need gasoline. It doesn't matter how fast the car is. It doesn't matter how expensive the car is. It doesn't run on peanut butter. Similarly, as a critical thinker, if you want good quality thoughts that are likely to be true or most likely to be true, then you need to rely on the best sources possible, right? So let's just take a little visual overview of what our sources are going to look like. Hopefully you can see this little bit in the corner. It's science. If you can't, that's okay. We'll get to it. But these are the sources that we're going to look at this chapter. We have testimony and anecdote. We've already talked about that previously. We have ancient texts. There are going to be some rules that we have involving ancient texts and how to think about them. Then also we will have a section on fallacies. Fallacies, you haven't heard that term yet, most likely. It's just a fancy name for doing something wrong. A fallacy is an error in thinking that comes up so much that it actually has a name. That'll make more sense in a minute. Then we'll look also at mass media and the internet, just a very brief overview there. Some things that you need to remember when you are investigating a supposed authority on a topic. And then also we are going to look at science as a source of information because science is biased. It has a bias and we need to be aware of it in order to draw information that's most likely to lead us to true conclusions. Okay, this is just an outline of the very thing that I just went over, but if you're taking notes, this might be a good way to start it out, right? Testimony and anecdotal evidence, ancient text, fallacies, mass media and the internet, authority or expert, and science. Okay, so this is just going to be like a little checklist that you're going to have in your head. All right, how are we going to examine sources, right? How are we going to look at all this different stuff? Well, we're going to do so by considering astrology. That's what the book does, right? So it's going to help us to understand how to think about sources, to understand astrology. So let's just chat a little bit about astrology. Astrology is the claim that the position of the stars and the planets at the time of our birth determines our personalities and specific events within our lives. The idea here is that the constellation of stars close to the sun when you were born determines your sign and thus your personality and events within your life. So the belief is astrology is often considered what's called correlative. Big word, correlative. That's just a fancy way for saying where the stars are when you're born correlates to something in your behavior or something in your life. There's a relationship there between the stars and your birth. And so sections of the zodiac are defined by these constellations, and we'll get into this, but basically the idea here is that the Babylonian astrology, which is what we're looking at here, what we use most of the time, divides the sky into 12 different houses. And the houses are essentially what stars are visible in the sky at the time you were born. And there are 12 of them. including Ophiuchus, which is usually left out. Now, how does astrology work? Let me give you the book's explanation of it, and it's pretty fair. These are the stars that correspond to the symbol for Libra, and they're traditionally thought to represent scales. And so persons born under the sign of Libra are thought to be fair. They're concerned with fairness and justice and equality and so forth. Now, I have here a small picture of Lee Harvey Oswald. For those of you who don't know who that is, that's the man who shot and killed John F. Kennedy, or at least who was blamed for it. But there's evidence that he did commit this crime. He was not a fair guy, right? Lee Harvey Oswald. He shot somebody in the back of the head, in fact, and then he shot a police officer afterwards. So the claim is that, well, how fair could this person be, right? If he's shooting people in the back of the head, he's shooting innocent police officers and so forth. Most of the people who knew Oswald, fairness is not something that springs to mind when they think about Oswald. Oswald was typically a difficult person to get along with, someone who was primarily interested in his own with himself. We'll just say that. He wasn't so much concerned with fairness, but that's the idea. That's how this is supposed to work. Because this shape is here in the stars, when he was born, he is supposed to have this kind of attribute himself. But this is the idea here. Is that like goes with like, right? This looks like this. This is fair, so this person must be fair because this was in the stars, right? This is something called the representativeness heuristic. You don't need to worry about that now. We'll talk about it down the line, but there are real problems with it. But that's the idea behind astrology, that there are shapes in the sky. These shapes remind us of the traits that someone might have, or reminds us of a picture, and those pictures have associations, and those associations must attach to the people who are born when these pictures are in the sky. But I think, if Lee Harvey Oswald was born on Mars and he saw different constellations, he would have still been of similar personality. Maybe not. Okay. Briefly, I'm just going to talk about a problem with astrology here, which is that the Earth has moved, and so the representative zodiacs are in very different positions, but that doesn't change. Most astrologists have not changed their charts and so forth since this access. They keep using this old Babylonian one, was developed thousands of years ago. Now, why you would do this, I don't know. If someone tells you that you're dialing the wrong number, you would stop dialing the number, right? You wouldn't continue to dial the same wrong number. You would simply you would find out what the right one is. And so the same thing is happening here. It's the same idea. Look, you're using this old chart. That's not where the stars are anymore. Doesn't faze most astrologists. Not all, but most. Okay. The book talks about this too. And what the book is talking about when they say this is that when new evidence becomes available, you should change your theory to meet with that new evidence. But astrology doesn't do this. And they talk about Sagittarius A and how the star that is titled Sagittarius A is actually a series of stars. And in the center of it, there's a black hole and so forth. And so all of this new evidence that's coming to light should alter perhaps how we see astrology, but it doesn't. So that's a good section there in the book. Okay, let's talk about... now that we've talked about astrology and given a couple problems with it, let's talk about testimony as a source of evidence. So there are real problems with testimony and anecdote as evidence. So what does that even mean? Anecdote or testimony is a fancy name for a story, right? So if I tell you that I mowed my lawn, and when I was mowing my lawn, I ran over a tennis ball. That's an anecdote. That's a story about something that happened, and I'm just relaying to you what happened in that story. Now, it turns out we use anecdotes all the time. We use stories most of the time for very mundane things. I might ask my wife, oh gosh, do we have any more bread? I'm going to go buy more bread. Well, then I'll rely on her story that, yes, I bought bread yesterday or something like that. Most of the time, they function okay, but it's kind of an illusion because there are lots and lots and lots of ways that stories like this are bad evidence. Something that might tip you off to this is the extent to which stories are regulated in court. They're a very specific type of term for anecdotes and testimony in court, and that's called hearsay, and there are rigorous rules involving how hearsay is admitted into court and so forth. But the general idea is that it's bad evidence, and we're going to talk about why. First up, testimony can be contaminated by a belief that you may have. So a good example of this would be a famous test where they have people walking down a dark hallway, and they tell them ahead of time, as soon as you see that light flash, stop walking down the hallway. So these people begin walking down the hallway, and as soon as they think they see a light flash, they stop moving. So they'll be walking down the hallway. The observers are there just watching them, and all of a sudden they stop. And they'll ask, why did you stop? They say, well, there was a flash of light. Well, it turns out there was no flash of light. They've repeated this experiment with clicking sounds and so forth. And it turns out that if you are expecting something to happen, your brain, in some circumstances, will actually generate that stimulus for you on the basis of that belief or expectation. So stories generally can be contaminated by beliefs. Secondly, memory problems. And we'll focus on this later. But it turns out our memory is awful. Now, we think that we're remembering things properly, but we're not. What usually happens is memory is not a picture that you take. Memory is a dynamic process, and your memory will change over time. And so memory, even though we feel like we have a very high degree of confidence in our memory, it turns out that we can be wrong. And this just happened to me the other day. I was trying to think of an example for this for number one, contamination by beliefs. And I remembered reading a correspondence between two parties. And I thought, oh, there's a great example in there. And I looked at the example I wanted to use to demonstrate number one. And you know what? I had combined two different stories that were being discussed, two different concepts that were being discussed. But I was certain that that would fit like a glove. So we'll get into memory later. But our memory is surprisingly poor. Testimony and anecdote is very unreliable because these stories get told and retold, and we lose details. So this becomes a real problem because if I tell you a story and I leave out a couple of details, then you retell the story. The person to whom you tell the story has no idea that those details were ever there. Sorry if that was a huge rattle. They have no idea that those details were ever there. And as more details get removed and you tell and retell the story, you'll actually start to insert details, even trying to tell the story faithfully. Just think about a game of telephone and how difficult it is to get 8 people to repeat a sentence verbatim. It's very difficult. So that's definitely true with a story too. Also, a problem with testimony is that people are generally not aware of deception. If someone is trying to deceive you and they know what they're doing, they're likely to do it because you're not normally looking for deception. Not most people anyway. Some people certainly do. Lastly, and this is a real problem for testimony, stories can get made up, right? And there's no way to tell if they were made up or not. So suppose I tell you that yesterday in my house I did 100 push-ups or something like that. Well, you'd have no way to check. You would have to just rely on my own tale, right? My own claims to accuracy. So we have to be careful with anecdotes and testimony because they can be made up. People can be deceived and not know it. People could be telling and retelling a story, for the umpteenth time, and they've lost a lot of detail. These problems, the problem with telling a story or using it as evidence is that you have to rely upon your memory to tell the story, and your memory turns out to be surprisingly poor. And then first, of course, your version of the story is going to be contaminated by what you already believe to be true. Okay, so that was kind of a shotgun, but we had to get through that. These videos are built this way. They're just sort of, the idea is that you are going to have to rewind if something is not clear, or you need to email me or something. That's fine. Okay, now we're going to look at ancient texts. So ancient texts can span the globe. Anything that is an ancient text, so it could be the I Ching, it could be it could be the Epic of Gilgamesh, any ancient story or ancient text. It could be something written by Plato or Aristotle, right? If we're using it as a source of information, we need to ask ourselves these three questions, or at least keep them in mind in order to evaluate the text. The first one is the claim ambiguous? Meaning, does the claim have more than one meaning? So this comes up sometimes when you are translating an ancient text from one language to another, and it's not quite clear which word you should use. That's why you have hundreds of copies or hundreds of different translations of something like Plato's Republic, because it can get a little gray when you're translating from ancient Greek, right? Exactly what do you mean here? Now, how strict you are, how vague the meaning is, really depends on the context. Sometimes, very general translations are fine, but sometimes just ancient texts are so old, it's very hard for us to understand the context in which they were written or produced, and so we're not sure, we don't get the whole story. Secondly, when you're evaluating an ancient text, you want to ask yourself if there are contradictions within the text that lead you to just pick a certain meaning. So sometimes this happens. Suppose someone is talking about Atlantis, and there's a famous dialogue by Plato where he discusses Atlantis, and it's funny. He says, yes, this is a true story, but it was told to me by someone else who was also told by someone else. And I just recently told this story at a festival and I won a prize for it. Well, which is it? Is this story true, or is this, right? Is this true, or is this a tale? The reason why this will lead into our third point in just a second, but it looks like he's telling us that this is true, but if it's two people removed, there would be no way for him to know that this is true, right? So the idea is, I think his father told him, and a historian told his father, or something like that. Well, then you don't know whether the tale is true. You just know that someone has told this story, right? So there can often be in an ancient text contradictions, and people just pick what they want, right? So if I really want Atlantis to be a true story, of course I'm going to focus on that passage where it says, yeah, this is in fact a true story. He says so. Well, no, the character in the dialogue says so, he also mentions this detail, which we now know something about. This leads us into 3, that he told this story at a festival and he won a prize. Well, that's a Greek custom, and Greeks would do that. They would tell a story, and the best story won a prize. Well, those stories were often fiction. They were understood to be fiction. So we know that now in light of what we know about Greek cultural practices, and so we can elucidate this as a contradiction, right? So sometimes we know things that the writers of ancient texts don't know, and so that affects how we interpret the texts. Okay, those are just 3 kind of shotgun things, and I'm sorry this lecture is very dense, but just try to move through, take it a bit at a time, take notes. Okay, another thing that we're going to consider when we are dealing with sources is fallacies. And there are some fallacies that take place with ancient texts, and there are some fallacies that just take place with sources generally. Now, I haven't told you what these fallacies are yet. I'm going to do that now, and we will talk about fallacies more in the next chapter in logic. But let me just give you 4 examples that involve these different kinds of sources, and so hopefully this will make sense. The first one is called appeal to popularity, and the general thinking is here, well, if it is popular, then it is true. So a good example of this might be something like people have, or say, you'd say something like 30% of the people alive now believe in Bigfoot or something like that. Well, that's great, but it doesn't make it true, right? Lots of people used to think that the world was flat, but that didn't make the world flat. You can't look at what's popular and use that as a measuring stick for what's true. Popularity and truth are 2 different things, but people often treat them as the same thing. The second thing is called an appeal to authority. So this happens very often with a source. Someone will say, oh gosh, Mr. Jones is a quantum physicist, so if he says something, it must be true, right? So if Mr. Jones says that people have psychic powers, well, Mr. Jones has a bunch of degrees, so it must be true. No, that's not right. Look, Mr. X may believe that it's true, or Mrs. X may believe that something is true, but it doesn't make it true. What makes something true is not Mr. or Mrs. X's belief. With regard to just continuing the Bigfoot notion, there's a very famous scientific researcher, Jane Goodall, and she believes, or at least it did at one point, believe in Bigfoots as a sort of undiscovered primate. And for a number of Bigfoot enthusiasts, this was enough. And they said, well, gosh, if Jane Goodall says that it's true, then it must be true. Well, that's not right. Now, an informed authority can actually help us or give us a starting point. They can inform our opinion, but they can't make something true. So that's the difference there. When I'm appealing to authority, I'm saying because somebody says it, then it must be true, but that's not right. An expert can tell us, right? An authority figure can inform our opinion, but they cannot make something that we believe true. And the third thing, and this often comes up with ancient texts, is that somebody says, well, if it is old, then it is true. It's kind of this appeal to ancient wisdom. And the idea here is that, suppose I am, just take a break. Okay. No, it's okay. I can edit it out now. It's easier to do that. Let me think. Okay, so let's move on to appeal to ancient wisdom here. Sometimes people think that just because something is old, it is true. So suppose there's some ancient, ancient Sumerian practice of dipping your wounds in mint leaves or something. No, that's horrible. Okay, here we go. So let's talk about appeal to ancient wisdom is number 3. Let's talk about that. The idea behind an appeal to ancient wisdom is because something is old, it must be true. So sometimes people say, well, gosh, look at the chi energy lines that are used in ancient China. They've been used for thousands of years, so they must be true. No, that's not right. Just because something is old or it's been done for a while doesn't mean that it's true or it's the right thing to do. In fact, most of the time, ancient knowledge like that is going to be more unreliable because we knew less about the world then, right? So herbal remedies do exist and some are effective, but some are not. And we know this now because we know the compounds in many of herbs and so forth. So hopefully that clarifies 3. Number 4, this is always a problem with anecdotal evidence. Someone makes a hasty generalization, and I apologize, there's a major typo right there in slide 10. The hasty generalization takes this term. This thing has a certain property, so all the other things also have this property. This happens with anecdotes all the time, right? Your friend buys a new car, They've researched it. It looks like it's going to be a great car. They buy it, they take it home, and the transmission falls out of the car, or something like that. And somebody says, oh, you know, those certain kinds of cars are awful because John drove his home and the transmission fell out. Well, we can't say that because John's transmission fell out in his car, all of the other cars that are, you know, of a similar model are also bad. It's just the idea that we can't generalize on the basis of one thing. It would be too quick, right? So we need to be careful. Okay, let's talk about fallacies. Okay, let's talk about this here. Let's do mass media and the internet. Now, we could do an entire course on mass media and the internet. We won't be doing that now, obviously, but we're going to cover a few main points. First thing to remember is most of the time, mass media and internet, they're really vehicles for commerce, right? Someone's trying to sell you something. If someone's charging $700 for a cast of a Yeti or a Bigfoot, they're doing that to make money. They're not doing it to get Bigfoot out there to the people, right? Same thing is true for different media programs. They're there to make money. They're there to sell advertising time. They're not there necessarily to get the truth out. Also, media productions and so forth, like, you know, Bigfoot Camp or something, those are often very heavily edited. I once talked to somebody who's kind of goes regularly on those shows, and he told me, oh, they'll film me talking for 2 or 3 days, and they'll use, you know, 5 or 10 minutes of my footage. And that's not unusual. So those shows are often heavily edited. And sometimes, in fact, they contain just outright misrepresentations of particular events. So just keep that in mind. Okay, let's move on here. Sorry, my computer's like flipping out while all this stuff is happening. Okay, next up. An authority figure. And just a few things that you need to remember when it comes to authority figures. And the book gives a little more explanation here when it talks about, well, we'll talk about that in a second. I'll add that. I wanted to add a little something here, but I don't want to get off track. So whenever your source is an authority on a topic, so if you're listening to a show and someone is talking about biology, you want to make sure that that person who's talking has the relevant education and training that's necessary to make those claims. Are they experienced? Do they have accomplishments within the field? Are they current? And are they respected among peers? So these are just little checklists. If you're reading a book on physics, was it written by a physicist? That would help. If it's written by someone who doesn't know anything about physics, chances are it's less likely to be correct. So I hope that makes sense. It's just a brief little overview of authority. And, science. This was the icon that was blocked out a little bit earlier on. Science is often a source of information for us, but it has problems. First and foremost, sometimes people commit fraud in science. It happens because they're people for any number of reasons. They want to get a job, they want to keep a job, they want to splash their name out there. There are just a number of reasons why someone might commit fraud in a scientific context. And the best defense to scientific fraud is something called replicability, which we talked about earlier. Remember the little arrow? And here the idea is that if someone's making a scientific claim, anyone can go and test that claim, right? They can go to their own laboratories and determine whether or not it's true. And so that's one of the great enemies of fraud. It's replicability, right? I know that you're lying, you're committing fraud if I can't reproduce the experiment the same way you did when I did everything you did. So there can be fraud in science, but the defense to it is replicability. Secondly, there's a big push in science for positive results, right? The way science works is people submit their studies to different journals. And those journals want to make a splash, right? They want to be the best journal in town. And so they want to publish a scientific study that finds some new amazing result. They don't want the study that says, oh yeah, here was a scientific study that cost, $15 million, and by the way, what they were looking for wasn't there. Well, who wants that, right? Somebody wants a good read. They want to sell journal articles. They want to enhance their reputation. And so in order to do that, there's a focus on positive results, and studies that have positive results that people later find flaws with, those flaws are less likely to be published because the journal, again, doesn't want to publish a retraction of their best-selling issue, right? They're just like, well, and the people who might be critiquing the study, they don't want to destroy their prior study too. Instead, they know that the study is bad and they move on and abandon it. Sometimes people have their jobs, their teaching jobs, or their research positions, and they all depend upon positive results. So all of these things kind of come together to tell you, number one, science does have a bias, and number two, you need to look for it. So science isn't perfect. If anybody tells you that it is, it's not, but it's good. It's great, in fact. Science gives us planes. If you don't like science, don't get on the plane, right? Okay, but it doesn't solve everything, and it's not perfect. All right, this is just an overview of what we just covered. I know this was a lot. It was kind of choppy for you guys, but unfortunately, it's just the nature of where we are. We looked at testimony and anecdotes, why those can be unreliable. Ancient texts gave you a couple of things to look for when you're dealing with ancient texts. Fallacies, which are like errors in reasoning, and that'll make a little more sense next time, but hopefully those 4 that I gave you will help. We talked about mass media and the internet. Again, the big thing here is don't expect it to be true. Expect it to be a product that someone has produced so that they can sell airtime. As a result, it's not a great source of information because it's more likely to be popular than it is to be true. Then when we talk about authority, just make sure that you keep in mind that the person must be qualified in the subject that they're teaching, right, or that they're talking about. So if I'm a physicist and I'm talking about biology, I may well be out of my league. Then science. Remember, science is not perfect. It has its own biases, and we have to be ready for them. Oh, and you probably can't see that again. I'll fix it. Okay, I hope that helps you guys. The book just chats briefly about this. I'm not going to cover it too much, except that it's going to be a test question. He talks about Hume's Maxim. Hume's Maxim it has particular phrasing, but basically, when someone tells you a crazy story, right, that Professor Witt flew to campus with his arms flapping, what would be more likely? That person is wrong, or that there really was something miraculous involved in Professor Witt's flying? Well, it's more likely the person is going to be wrong, right? So this gives you a tool for deciding whether or not to believe someone who is making an extraordinary claim. So that's Hume's Maxim. It is a test question, so I wanted to throw it in there for you guys. But he kind of threw it in at the end, and I want to integrate it, but we'll talk about it a little bit later. Okay, you guys, that covers it for chapter 3. I know this was a lot, and it was sort of chop, 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 but hopefully you have enough now between the book and this lecture to go in and kill that exam. If you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to email me. I will talk to you guys soon.